Tantor Audio presents The Fall of the Ottomans, The Great War in the Middle East, by Eugene Rogan, narrated by Perkins. Preface. Lance Corporal John MacDonald died at Gallipoli on 28 June 1915. He was 19 years old, and though he wasn't to know it, he was my great-uncle. Nothing in his life would have prepared John MacDonald for death in faraway lands. He was born in a small Scottish village near Perth and attended the Dollar Academy, where he met his best friend, Charles Beveridge. They left school together at 14 to look for work. The two friends moved to Glasgow, where they found jobs with the North British Locomotive Company. When war broke out in Europe in the summer of 1914, Beveridge and MacDonald enlisted together with the Scottish Rifles, also known as the Cameronians. The impatient recruits of the 8th Scottish Rifles spent the autumn months in training, envious of other battalions that preceded them to battle in France. Only in April 1915 was the 1st 8th Battalion called into service, not in France, but in Ottoman Turkey. MacDonald and Beveridge said their final farewells to friends and family on 17 May 1915, when their battalion set off for war. They sailed to the Greek island of Lemnos, which served as the staging post for British and Allied forces before deployment to Gallipoli. As they drew into the island's port of Mudros on 29 May, 1 month after the initial Gallipoli landings, they passed a vast armada of warships and transports lying at anchor. The young recruits would have been awestruck by the dreadnoughts and super-dreadnoughts, some of the greatest ships afloat. Many bore the marks of heavy fighting in the Dardanelles, their hulls and funnels holed by Turkish artillery and ground batteries. The Scots had 2 weeks to acclimatise to the eastern Mediterranean summer before going into battle. In mid-June they sailed out of Mudros harbour, cheered by soldiers and sailors from the decks of the ships at anchor. Only those who had been to Gallipoli and knew what lay before the fresh-faced young recruits refrained from cheering. To a shipload of Australians sick and wounded, one Cameronian recalled, some of our fellows yelled out the stock phrase at that time, "Are we downhearted? No." And when some Australian wag shouted back, "Well, you damned soon will be," our chaps, though taken aback, were incredulous. On 14 June, the entire battalion was safely ashore. 4 days later, the 8th Scottish Rifles moved up Gully Ravine to the front line. Under the relentless machine gun and artillery fire for which Gallipoli was already notorious, the Cameronians suffered their first casualties in the trenches. By the time the Scottish Rifles were given their orders to attack Turkish positions, the men had lost their boyish enthusiasm. As one officer reflected, whether it was premonition or merely the strain of newly acquired responsibility, I could not feel the buoyancy of success among the soldiers. The British attack on 28 June was preceded by 2 hours of bombardment from the sea. Eyewitnesses dismissed the shelling as ineffectual, far too little to drive the determined Ottoman soldiers from their defensive positions. The British assault began on schedule at 1100 hours. As on the Western Front, the men climbed out of their trenches to the shrill signal of whistles. When the Cameronians went over the top, they faced the full fire of Ottoman soldiers who held their positions, undeterred by the bombardment from British ships. Within 5 minutes, the 1st 8th Scottish Rifles were practically wiped out. John MacDonald died of his wounds in a camp hospital and was buried in the Lancaster Landing Cemetery. Charles Beveridge fell beyond the reach of stretcher-bearers. His remains were only recovered after the 1918 armistice, when his bones were indistinguishable from those of the men who had fallen around him. He lies in a mass grave, his name engraved on the great monument at Cape Helles. The fate of the Cameronians brought shock and grief to their friends and families in Scotland. The Dollar Academy published obituaries for John MacDonald and Charles Beveridge in the autumn issue of the school quarterly. The magazine described the two young men as the best of friends. They worked together, lived together in rooms, enlisted together, and, in their death, they were not divided. Both were young men of sterling character, the obituary concluded, well worthy of the positions they held. The magazine expressed sympathy for the two boys' bereaved parents. In fact, the grief proved more than my great-grandparents could bear. 1 year after the death of their only son, the MacDonalds took the extraordinary step of leaving wartime Scotland to emigrate to the United States. In July 1916, during a pause in German U-boat attacks on Atlantic shipping, they boarded the poignantly named SS Cameronia with 2 of their daughters, headed for New York City. They never returned. The family ultimately settled in Oregon, where my maternal grandmother later married and gave birth to my mother and uncle. They and all of their descendants owe their lives to John MacDonald's premature death. My personal connection to the First World War is hardly unique. A 2013 poll conducted in the United Kingdom by the YouGov agency found that 46% of Britons knew of a family or community member who had served in the Great War. Such personal connections explain the enduring fascination the First World War holds over so many of us a century after its outbreak. The sheer scale of the mobilization and the carnage left few families untouched in those countries caught up in the conflict. I came to learn my great-uncle's history while preparing for a trip to Gallipoli in 2005. My mother, Margaret, my son, Richard, and I, representatives of 3 generations, went to pay our respects, his first family visitors in over 9 decades. As we made our way down the twisted lanes of the Gallipoli Peninsula towards the Lancashire Landing Cemetery, we took a wrong turn and chanced on the Nuri Yamut monument, a memorial to the Turkish war dead of 28 June, the same battle in which John MacDonald and Charles Beveridge had died. The monument to the Turkish war dead of what they called the Battle of Zeindere, or Gully Ravine, came as a total revelation to me. While my great-uncle's unit had suffered 1,400 casualties, half its total strength, and British losses overall reached 3,800, as many as 14,000 Ottomans fell dead and wounded at Gully Ravine. The Nuri Yamut monument is the mass grave of those Ottoman soldiers, interred under a common marble tombstone inscribed simply, Şehitlik, Martyrdom, 1915. All the books I had read on the Cameronians treated the terrible waste of British life on the day my great-uncle had died. None of the English sources had mentioned the thousands of Turkish war dead. It was sobering to realize that the number of bereaved Turkish families would have so surpassed the number of those grieving in Scotland. I came away from Gallipoli struck by how little we in the West know about the Turkish and Arab experiences of the Great War. The scores of books published in English on the different Middle Eastern fronts reflect British or Allied experiences. Gallipoli was Churchill's debacle, Kut el Amara, Townshend's surrender. The Arab revolt was led by Lawrence of Arabia. It was Maud's entry to Baghdad and Allenby's conquest of Jerusalem. Social historians, keen to break with the official history's top-down approach, probed the experiences of the common soldier by reading the diaries and letters held in private paper archives in London's Imperial War Museum, Canberra's Australian War Memorial, and Wellington's Alexander Turnbull Library. After a century of research, we have a comprehensive view of the Allied side of the trenches. But we are only just beginning to come to terms with the other side, the experiences of Ottoman soldiers caught up in a desperate struggle for survival against powerful invaders. It is actually quite difficult to approach the Ottoman front from the Turkish side of the trenches. While there are dozens of diaries and memoirs published in Turkey and the Arab world, few Western historians have the language skills to read them, and only a fraction of published primary sources are available in translation. Archival materials are even harder to access. The Turkish Military and Strategic Studies Archive in Ankara, Asgari Tori ve Stratejik Etüt Başkanlığı Arşivi, or ATASE, holds the largest collection of primary materials on the First World War in the Middle East. Yet access to ATASE is strictly controlled, with researchers required to pass a security clearance that can take months and is often denied. Large parts of the collection are closed to researchers who face restrictions on copying materials. However, a number of Turkish and Western scholars have gained access to this collection and are beginning to publish important studies on the Ottoman experience of the Great War. Elsewhere in the Middle East, national archives, where they exist, were established well after the conflict and do not place particular emphasis on the Great War. Neglect of the First World War in Arab archives is reflected in Arab society at large. Unlike in Turkey, where the Gallipoli battlefield is punctuated with Turkish monuments and memorial celebrations are held each year, there are no war memorials in the towns and cities of the Arab world. Though nearly every modern Arab state was drawn into the Great War in one way or another, the conflict is remembered as someone else's war, a time of suffering inflicted on the Arab people by the failing Ottoman Empire and its rash young Turk leadership. In the Arab world, the Great War left martyrs, especially Arab activists, hanged in central squares of Beirut and Damascus that were subsequently renamed Martyrs' Square in both cities, but no heroes. It is time to restore the Ottoman front to its rightful place in the history of both the Great War and the modern Middle East. For, more than any other event, the Ottoman entry into the war turned Europe's conflict into a world war. As opposed to the minor skirmishes in the Far East and East Africa, major battles were fought over the full 4 years of the war in the Middle East. Moreover, the Middle Eastern battlefields were often the most international of the war. Australians and New Zealanders, every ethnicity in South Asia, North Africans, Senegalese, and Sudanese made common cause with French, English, Welsh, Scottish, and Irish soldiers against the Turkish, Arab, Kurdish, Armenian, and Circassian combatants in the Ottoman army and their German and Austrian allies. The Ottoman front was a veritable Tower of Babel, an unprecedented conflict between international armies. Most Entente war planners dismissed the fighting in the Ottoman Empire as a sideshow to the main theatres of war on the Western and Eastern fronts. Influential Britons like Horatio Herbert Kitchener and Winston Churchill only lobbied to take the war to the Turks in the mistaken belief this would provide the Allies with a quick victory against the Central Powers that would hasten the end of the war. Having underestimated their opponents, the Allies found themselves embroiled in major campaigns in the Caucasus, the Dardanelles, Mesopotamia, and Palestine that diverted hundreds of thousands of troops from the Western Front and served to lengthen the Great War. Allied failures on the Ottoman front provoked grave political crises at home. The foundering Dardanelles campaign forced British Liberal Prime Minister H. Asquith into a coalition government with the Conservatives in May 1915 and contributed to Asquith's downfall the following year. British wartime defeats in Gallipoli and Mesopotamia led to 2 separate parliamentary commissions of inquiry whose reports were equally damning of political and military decision-makers. If the Ottomans turned Europe's conflict into a world war, it is equally true that the Great War transformed the modern Middle East. Virtually no part of the region was spared its ravages. Men were recruited from across Turkey and the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire and from every colonial state in North Africa. Civilians, too, suffered from the economic hardship and epidemics unleashed by the war. Battles were fought in territory of the modern states of Egypt, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Israel, and the Palestinian territories, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Turkey, and Iran. The majority of those countries emerged into statehood as a direct consequence of the fall of the Ottoman Empire following the end of the First World War. The fall of the Ottomans was an epochal event. For over 6 centuries, theirs stood as the greatest Islamic empire in the world. Founded at the end of the 13th century by tribesmen from Central Asia, the Ottoman Sultanate emerged as a dynasty to challenge the Byzantine Empire in both Asia Minor and the Balkans. Following Sultan Mehmed II's conquest of the Byzantine capital, Constantinople, in 1453, the Ottomans emerged as the greatest power in the Mediterranean world. With Constantinople, subsequently renamed Istanbul, as their capital, the Ottomans rapidly extended their conquests. In 1516, Selim I defeated the Cairo-based Mamluk Empire and added Syria, Egypt, and the Red Sea province of the Hijaz to Ottoman domains. In 1529, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent was at the gates of Vienna, spreading fear across Europe. The Ottomans continued to expand until their final attempt on Vienna in 1683, by which time the empire spanned 3 continents, comprising the Balkans, Asia Minor, known to the Turks as Anatolia, the Black Sea, and most of the Arab lands from Iraq to the borders of Morocco. Over the next 2 centuries, the Ottomans were overtaken by the dynamism of Europe. They began to lose wars to their neighbours, to the Russian Empire of Catherine the Great, and to the Habsburg emperors whose capital, Vienna, they previously had menaced. Starting in 1699, Ottoman frontiers retreated in the face of external challenges. By the early 19th century, the Ottomans began to lose territory to new nationalist movements emerging within their Balkan provinces. Greece was the first to make a bid for independence after an 8-year war against Istanbul's rule, 1821 to 1829. Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro secured their independence in 1878, with Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Bulgaria gaining autonomy at the same time. The great powers continued to seize Ottoman territory, with Britain claiming Cyprus and Egypt between 1878 and 1882, France occupying Tunisia in 1881, and Russia annexing 3 provinces in the Ottoman Caucasus in 1878. As it struggled against internal and external threats to its territory, by the early 20th century, political analysts predicted the imminent demise of the Ottoman Empire. A group of patriotic young officers, calling themselves the Young Turks, held out the hope that the empire could be revived through constitutional reform. In 1908, they rose in rebellion against the autocratic reign of Sultan Abdul Hamid II, reigned 1876 to 1909, in a desperate bid to save their state. With the rise of the Young Turks to power, the Ottomans entered a period of unprecedented turbulence that would ultimately draw the empire into its last and greatest war. 1. A Revolution and 3 Wars, 1908 to 1913. Between 1908 and 1913, the Ottoman Empire faced grave internal and external threats. Starting with the Young Turk Revolution in 1908, the political institutions of the centuries-old empire came under unprecedented strain. Domestic reformers sought to bring the empire into the 20th century. European imperial powers and the newly emergent Balkan states went to war with the Turks in pursuit of Ottoman territory. Armenian and Arab activists sought greater autonomy from the weakened Turkish state. These issues, which dominated the Ottoman government's agenda in the years leading up to 1914, laid the foundations for the Ottoman Great War. The aging Sultan Abdul Hamid II convened his cabinet in a crisis session on 23 July 1908. The autocratic monarch faced the greatest domestic threat to his rule in over 3 decades on the throne. The Ottoman army in Macedonia, that volatile Balkan region straddling the modern states of Greece, Bulgaria, and Macedonia, had risen in rebellion, demanding the restoration of the 1876 constitution and a return to parliamentary rule. The Sultan knew the contents of the constitution better than his opponents. One of his first measures on ascending the Ottoman throne in 1876 had been to promulgate the constitution as the culmination of 4 decades of government-led reforms, known as the Tanzimat. In those days he was seen as an enlightened reformer. But the experience of ruling the Ottoman Empire had hardened Abdul Hamid from reformer into absolutist. The roots of Abdul Hamid's absolutism can be traced to a series of crises the young sultan faced at the very start of his reign. The empire he inherited from his predecessors was in disarray. The Ottoman treasury had declared bankruptcy in 1875, and its European creditors were quick to impose economic sanctions on the sultan's government. The Ottomans faced growing hostility from European public opinion in 1876 for the violent suppression of Bulgarian separatists branded the Bulgarian Horrors by the Western press. The Liberal leader, William Gladstone, led British condemnation of Turkey, and war was brewing with Russia. The pressure took its toll on the rulers of the empire. A powerful group of reformist officers deposed Sultan Abdulaziz, reigned 1861 to 1876, who, less than a week later, was found dead in his apartments, the veins of his wrist slashed, an apparent suicide. His successor, Murat V, collapsed in a nervous breakdown after only 3 months on the throne. Against this inauspicious background, the 33-year-old Abdul Hamid II ascended to power on 31 August 1876. Powerful cabinet ministers pressed the new sultan to introduce a liberal constitution and an elected parliament with Muslim, Christian and Jewish members as a means to prevent further European intervention in domestic Ottoman affairs. Abdul Hamid conceded to the demands of the reformists in his government, more out of a sense of pragmatism than conviction. On 23 December 1876 he promulgated the Ottoman constitution, and on 19 March 1877 he opened the first session of the elected Ottoman parliament. Yet no sooner had the parliament met than the empire was embroiled in a devastating war with Russia. The Russian Empire saw itself as the successor to Byzantium and the spiritual head of the Eastern Orthodox Church. Russia also had expansionist aims. It coveted the Ottoman capital, Istanbul, which until 1453 had been the centre of Orthodox Christianity, and the Byzantine capital, Constantinople. These were more than just cultural ambitions. Once in possession of Istanbul, the Russians would control the geostrategic straits of the Bosporus and the Dardanelles, linking Russia's Black Sea ports to the Mediterranean. Throughout the 19th century, however, it suited Russia's European neighbours to confine the Tsar's fleet to the Black Sea by preserving the territorial integrity of the Ottoman Empire. Frustrated in their aspirations to occupy Istanbul and the Straits, the Russians exploited Balkan nationalist independence movements to interfere with Ottoman affairs while advancing their territorial aims through periodic wars with the Ottomans. By the end of 1876, troubles in Serbia and Bulgaria provided Russia the opportunity for another expansionist war. After securing Austrian neutrality and Romania's permission for Russian forces to march through its territory, Russia declared war on the Ottomans in April 1877. The Tsar's forces made rapid gains into Ottoman territory in the Balkans and, attacking through the Caucasus into eastern Anatolia, massacring Turkish and Muslim peasants as they swept forward in their two-front assault. The Russian attack provoked public outrage in Ottoman domains. Sultan Abdul Hamid II played on his Islamic credentials to secure popular support in the war against Russia. He took the banner of the Prophet Muhammad, which had been in Ottoman keeping since the empire occupied the Arab lands in the 16th century, and declared jihad, or holy war, against the Russians. The Ottoman public rallied to their warrior sultan, volunteering for military service and contributing money to the war effort, and the armed forces managed to bring the Russian advances into Ottoman territory to a halt. While Abdul Hamid was gaining popular support for the war effort, members of Parliament, MPs, were growing increasingly critical of the government's handling of the conflict. Despite the Sultan's jihad, the Russians had resumed their forward progress by the end of 1877 and reached the outskirts of Istanbul in late January 1878. In February, the Sultan convened a meeting with parliamentarians to consult on the conduct of the war. One MP, who was the head of the Bakers' Guild, chided the Sultan, "You have asked for our opinions too late. You should have consulted us when it was still possible to avert disaster. The Chamber declines all responsibility for a situation for which it had nothing to do." The Bakers' intervention seems to have convinced the Sultan that the Parliament was more of a hindrance than a help to the national cause. The very next day, Abdul Hamid suspended the constitution, dissolved Parliament, and placed some of the most critical MPs under house arrest. Abdul Hamid then began to exercise direct control over the affairs of state. By that point, however, the military situation was beyond salvation, and the young Sultan had to accept an armistice in January 1878, with Russian forces at the gates of his capital. In the aftermath of defeat to Russia in 1878, The Ottomans suffered tremendous territorial losses in the peace treaty concluded in the Congress of Berlin, June to July 1878. Hosted by Germany and attended by the European powers, Britain, France, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, the Congress sought to resolve not just the Russo-Turkish War, but the many conflicts in the Balkans as well. By the terms of the Treaty of Berlin, the Ottomans lost 2/5 of the empire's territory and 1/5 of its population in the Balkans and eastern Anatolia. Among the territories surrendered were 3 provinces in the Caucasus region of eastern Anatolia, Kars, Ardahan, and Batum, that, as Turkish Muslim heartlands they could not be reconciled to losing, would come to be the Ottomans' Alsace-Lorraine. The Ottomans lost further territories to the European powers in addition to those surrendered in the Treaty of Berlin. Britain secured Cyprus as a colony in 1878, France occupied Tunisia in 1881, and after intervening in Egypt's 1882 crisis, Britain placed that autonomous Ottoman province under British colonial rule. These losses seemed to convince Sultan Abdulhamid II that he needed to rule the Ottoman Empire with a strong hand in order to protect it from further dismemberment by ambitious European powers. To his credit, between 1882 and 1908, Abdulhamid protected Ottoman domains from further dismemberment. Yet the territorial integrity of the state was preserved at the expense of its citizens' political rights. Abdulhamid's autocratic style of rule eventually gave rise to an increasingly organized opposition movement. The Young Turks were a disparate coalition of parties bound by the common goals of constraining Abdulhamid's absolutism, restoring constitutional rule, and returning to parliamentary democracy. Among the most prominent parties under the Young Turk umbrella was the Committee of Union and Progress, CUP, a secret society of civilians and military men founded in the early 1900s. Though the CUP had branches in all parts of the Ottoman Empire, the Arab lands, the Turkish provinces, and the Balkans, the movement had faced most repression in the Turkish and Arab provinces. By 1908, the CUP's centre of operations lay in the surviving Ottoman possessions in the Balkans, in Albania, Macedonia, and Thrace. In June 1908, spies working for the Sultan uncovered a CUP cell in the Ottoman Third Army in Macedonia. Faced with imminent court-martial, the military men decided to take action. On 3 July 1908, a CUP cell leader, named Adjutant Major Ahmed Niazi, led 200 well-armed soldiers and their civilian supporters in a revolt, demanding that the Sultan restore the 1876 constitution. They all fully expected to die in the attempt. However, the rebels captured the public's mood, and their movement gained momentum as it drew increasing support from the population at large. Whole cities in Macedonia rose in rebellion and declared their adherence to the constitution. A young Turk officer named Major Ismail Enver, who later rose to fame as just Enver, proclaimed the constitution in the Macedonian towns of Köprülü and Tikvesh to popular acclaim. The Ottoman Third Army threatened to march on Istanbul to impose the constitution in the empire's capital. 3 weeks on, the revolutionary movement had grown so big that the Sultan could no longer count on the loyalty of his military to contain the uprising in Macedonia. This was the emergency that drove the Sultan to convene his cabinet on 23 July. They met in Yildiz Palace, perched on a hill overlooking the Bosporus Straits on the European side of Istanbul. Intimidated by the 65-year-old Sultan, the ministers avoided raising the crucial question of the restoration of constitutional rule. They spent hours deliberating about whom to blame rather than addressing the necessary solution to the crisis. After a day spent listening to the tergiversations of his ministers, Abdulhamid brought the discussion to a close. "I will follow the current," he announced to the cabinet. "The constitution was first promulgated under my reign. I am the one who established it. For reasons of necessity it was suspended. I now wish for the ministers to prepare a proclamation restoring the constitution." The relieved ministers acted immediately on the Sultan's instructions and dispatched telegrams to all of the provinces of the empire to announce the dawn of the second constitutional era. For their success in forcing the Sultan to restore the constitution, the Young Turks were credited with having waged a revolution. It took a moment for the significance of the events to sink in. The newspaper.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?